This is Sycamore, System Breaker. Written by Craig A. Falconer. Narrated by Stephen Barnett. Introduction. Sycamore, System Breaker is a supersized companion story written especially for this compendium a full 6 years after any of the other Sycamore stories. It occurs in the same time frame as the stories you have just enjoyed in Sycamore X and the ones still to come in Sycamore XL. Given that the closing story of Sycamore XL was the originally intended final chapter of the series, I have opted to place System Breaker here before Sycamore XL. Arranging the stories in this order ensures this compendium provides an enhanced experience without changing the nature of the finale. Now, it's time to meet Peter Lehman and step into his defiant struggle against a system that seems intent on slowly breaking him. Chapter 1. Peter Lehman's life was not what it used to be. In Sycamore's world, no one's was. Where Peter had once driven to his job at the fire station, the price of gas now forced him to depend on the city's often unreliable bus service. Long waits in the cold winter mornings were already taking a toll on his health. After all, while Sycamore's real U service could spruce up the appearance of his tatty old coat for a very low price, augmented reality didn't stretch to making it any warmer. Today's commute began fairly well, with the bus showing up at its scheduled time. Things got even better after Peter waved his palm over the seed-reading device on the door. As he took a seat, a message played through the public announcement system telling him that a fault with the bus's electric windows meant they couldn't be open, as they usually were for spuriously defined health and safety reasons. This brought a welcome respite from the biting cold, which Peter always thought was more of a health hazard than a few coughs and sneezes. At the next stop, though, things took a turn for the worse. A young mother with 2 children, one in a stroller, was refused boarding due to a lack of funds in her Sycamore account. The driver seemed fairly neutral to the situation, neither apologetic nor sociopathically gleeful, but Peter couldn't sit silently and watch the poor family be shunned back onto the freezing streets. "I'll pay," he offered, stepping up from his seat near the front.
"Doesn't work like that," the driver grunted. "And even if it did, she doesn't have enough for the movement tax on her journey home. Even her overdraft is almost totally maxed out. A bus ticket is the least of her concerns. She's going to be facing an account enforcement issue by the end of the day. Way above my pay grade, or yours, buddy."
"What the hell is the hold-up?" someone called from the back of the bus. "Some of us have places to be!" Peter was heartbroken by the woman's defeated expression as she stepped off the bus. He felt helpless and impotent to do anything, but mainly he felt empathy for her situation. Sycamore's entire system had been striking him as increasingly toxic even before the movement tax came into effect, but now it seemed downright indefensible. The total surveillance everyone now lived under made it impossible for him to discuss dissent without getting into trouble, as the sudden disappearance of a few outspoken acquaintances made him only too aware. Although no one could say it, Peter believed deep down that everyone else had to be thinking the system was broken too. Sure, there were some assholes like the guy at the back of the bus who cared only for themselves, but Peter figured even he might just have been desperate to get to work to avoid missing out on any of his wages. The corporate dystopia created by Sycamore's intractable links to the government meant that all new ways of separating hard-working people from their money were regularly coming into place. The movement tax, while the most egregious charge of all, was far from the only new economic burden. Peter initially greeted the seed's rollout without any strong feelings. He foresaw some dangers of a kind he'd read only too often in classic literature, but he also foresaw some major conveniences. Within a few short weeks since then, however, he had come to loathe the world Sycamore was creating. Happiness wasn't a feeling Peter had known for many years, but his work in the fire service had at least brought meaning and purpose. He joined around a decade ago, at the relatively late age of 38, following the tragic death of his wife Claire in a gas explosion at the school where she taught. One firefighter died in the incident, during which the responding crew saved every child before they bravely went back into the building in a bid to rescue 2 teachers, including Claire, who had put the children's safety first and remained trapped on an upper level. Peter felt a debt of gratitude to the man who died trying to save the teachers, and he wanted to do all he could to make sure no one else would have to experience the loss he felt over his wife's untimely passing. But since Sycamore's inventions upended society in more ways than anyone could have seen coming, not even Peter's work was immune from their influence. In the past 2 weeks, his crew had been ordered to do work that had nothing to do with public safety. This included using their ladders to erect the outlines of enormous public screens, where augmented reality advertising could be placed without interfering with any of the more targeted placements that bombarded citizens on ground level as they tried to navigate the city in peace. Captain Hale, Peter's boss of around the same age, didn't like the orders any more than Peter did. But neither man could afford to speak out. In a literal sense, they needed their employment incomes to afford the necessities of life, but they also knew no one could get away with disobeying orders from the top. The unholy marriage between Sycamore Supremo Isaiah Amos and the country's political establishment had already permeated every aspect of society. Peter occasionally wondered why law enforcement went along with their orders to quell the slightest hint of dissent, but each time this crossed his mind, he reflected that the police officers in question were just like him, pawns in a game they couldn't refuse to play. The harrowing image of a young mother being kicked to the curb by the bus driver still lingered in Peter's mind as he stepped out at the stop nearest to the fire station.
"I don't make the rules,"
the driver said, noting Peter's evidently disapproving glance.
"And I need this job. You know how it is."
This time, the man didn't sound neutral. He sounded as helpless as Peter had felt watching the event unfold. Peter couldn't be angry at the driver. The real issue was that he did know how it was, and only too well. His anger fell squarely on the forces that were doing this to the world, not only swiftly crushing the concept of freedom, but more deeply chipping away at what it meant to be human. When he stepped outside, Peter tried not to look around too much. The sparkling buildings on both sides of the road annoyed him greatly, because he remembered what they looked like a month ago and knew that the graffiti and dirt was still there, hidden only by the veneer of Sycamore's augmented reality. Similarly, almost everyone else on the street was impeccably turned out in designer clothes and had neither a hair out of place nor a single skin blemish to be seen. Peter knew some of his colleagues had used one of the Real You app's far more expensive features to increase their height, as seen by others. Those were exceptions, given the cost involved, but things like daily hair and makeup were priced to appeal to the masses. Cynicism was coming to Peter more naturally than ever these days, and he assumed the cost of everything within Real You would rise soon and then keep on rising, once everyone was hooked. Peter was glad to reach the station. He greeted his colleagues, who he enjoyed spending time with, even though they could no longer openly discuss things like they used to. A climate of fear permeated even mundane situations, for reasons no one ever expressed out loud, but they all seemed to tacitly understand. Their truths, as was so often the case, lived between the lines. Captain Hale fought to maintain an expression that wasn't completely beaten down when he told his crew that they were going to be spending the day installing another giant screen. This wasn't the kind of work they should be doing, and certainly wasn't why any of them had joined the service, but there was nothing that could be done to change the orders. On their drive to the specified location, Peter noticed that his young colleague Mike was looking far more ragged than usual. He doesn't have any active Real You mods, Peter realized, spotting the much younger man's bloodshot eyes and chapped lips. Peter wanted to ask if everything was okay, but didn't have a chance to talk to Mike in private before they reached their destination. Mike was first up the ladder.
"Easy there,"
Peter called, alarmed by how quickly Mike was climbing. None of them were wearing their full gear like they would be on a real call-out, and Mike seemed to be making the most of the lack of extra weight as he hurried up to mark the first part of the outline on an existing building.
"Huh?"
Mike called, turning to glance at Peter. And then it happened. As the young man looked down, he lost his footing and slipped from the ladder. Peter felt his stomach churn as his eyes helplessly followed Mike's body as it plummeted to the ground from 20 floors up. Chapter 2. To Peter's immeasurable relief, Mike landed on a large inflatable pad positioned underneath the ladder. A landing from that height still couldn't be comfortable. Peter knew that from his own training. But Mike was going to be okay. Everyone hurried to the young man's aid, checking his condition and then helping him up. While they all led him back to their truck, Peter stood pensively near the base of the ladder, with an unplaceable but unshakable feeling that things weren't quite as they first seemed. He performed some touch gestures in his left palm to rewind his visual feed. His ultra lenses were then filled with a replay of the moment when Mike fell. Peter used a two-finger gesture to zoom in for a closer look at the key second. When he saw it, he had to suppress a gasp. He couldn't be absolutely certain, but it looked for all the world like Mike hadn't truly fallen. No. Albeit subtly, and albeit in a way that looked like it was intended to come across as an accidental slip, the young man had jumped. Captain Hale loudly announced that there would be no more work on the screen that day. He also promised to make sure none of his crew would be out of pocket, telling them he would have it out with the city government officials who kept giving them these tasks instead of hiring construction crews and leaving the fire department to do the jobs it was supposed to. "Enough is enough," Hale insistently boomed, to nods of universal agreement. Peter held his tongue during the drive back to the station. He would talk to Mike once they got there, and didn't want to address his suspicion in the wrong way. If Mike had jumped on purpose, he was clearly in a very delicate and concerning state of mind. Peter decided that when he did broach the topic, he wanted to make sure it came across as extending a hand of support rather than delivering a confrontational accusation. The drive back to the station didn't take long. Peter kept to himself while the others sat with Mike, who didn't appear to be too shaken up by having fallen from such a height. Because he was expecting to, Peter reflected. Because he meant to. At the station, Peter passed most of his workday on routine tasks. He heard Captain Hale raise his voice at one point during a call with city officials about the work his crew was being asked to do. Peter and his colleagues couldn't make out what was being said, but it definitely wasn't cordial. Mike left for a mandatory medical check and returned near the end of his and Peter's shifts. While they were at their lockers, alone in the area, Peter took his chance to speak up. "Are you doing okay?" he asked. Mike shrugged. "Bumps and bruises," they said. "Nothing worse." Peter took a moment to study the younger man's expression. Features that some consumers use to read each other's expressions, with helpful visual annotations from the system, were well out of Peter's financial reach. Despite this, he knew Mike was doing his best to hide some kind of serious problem. "So does that make you lucky or unlucky?" Peter asked. Mike said nothing. "Kid, whatever is going on, you can talk to me, or you can talk to someone. Falling off a ladder isn't the way. Whatever you're dealing with, that's not the way." At this, Mike gulped. The fact that he didn't deny anything or correct Peter's implications said everything, only reaffirming what Peter had already seen in the footage. Seconds later, as soon as he realized his facade was broken, Mike crouched to his knees and broke down in tears. The first thing Peter did was move towards the door and block it so no one else could walk in. Mike was a proud young man and had tried to hold this in. No one else had to see it. The second thing Peter did was crouch down next to Mike and put a hand on his shoulder. He said nothing for almost a full minute until Mike stood up straight and wiped his face with his palm in a single, firm motion. "I'm screwed," Mike sighed. "Peter, I've wrecked everything. My girlfriend is gone, I'm losing my place, and I've already sold everything that isn't nailed down. I just got a bunch of notices of interest payments coming due on all the buy now, pay later crap I fell for. and my wages are gone the second they arrive. I've tried and I've tried, but I can't stop. I can't even afford to exclude myself." Peter frowned in confusion. "Stop what, Mike? Exclude yourself from what?" "The gambling apps," Mike sighed. "First it was sports, now it's the casinos. The harder I try not to gamble, the more I do. It's consuming my whole life. I had a little bit of a problem before the seed, but since then it's just constant ads. Whispering voices in my ears telling me to fight boredom with a few quick spins. Betting odds popping up in my vision while I'm sitting on the couch. All of it. It's relentless, man. And it's beaten me. I'm done." "It hasn't beaten you yet," Peter insisted. He tried to take in everything Mike was telling him. He couldn't personally relate to the gambling compulsion, but this wasn't the first time he was hearing of problem gamblers falling completely off the wagon since Sycamore Systems pegged them as easy targets for high-value ad placements for rigged casino games. "I'm out of options," Mike went on. "Hale has been giving me extra shifts, which at least means there are a few extra hours I can't gamble. But the money is gone as soon as I get home. I've tried reaching out to Sycamore's safeguarding teams, but no one ever responds." "How much is the self-exclusion cost?" Peter asked. It sickened him that there was any cost for irreversibly opting out of gambling activity. Mike sighed heavily. $120 for a year? "This isn't charity. It's a loan," Peter said, tapping some gestures into his palm and then swiping through the air towards Mike to send him the credits. This was straightforward since Mike was a colleague and approved friend within the Forest app, unlike the woman who tried to get on the bus who Peter was unable to help so easily. Mike's eyes widened into golf balls. "Did you... Dude..." "Pay me back when you can," Peter said. "I've been feeling like I'm up against it lately too, but I'm not jumping off ladders. And I want to see you do the exclusion now, not later. The second you walk out of here, the ads will be all over you." Mike rushed forward and embraced Peter in a tight hug. "I can never thank you enough for this. I still have to deal with all the interest payments, but this is going to stop things from getting even worse. You're a lifesaver, man. Literally." As soon as they parted, Mike got down to the business at hand. He navigated through several menus and ignored desperate attempts by the system to get him to change his mind. Ultimately, he managed to self-exclude from all of Sycamore's gambling-related services. "Anyone in there?" Captain Hale's voice called from behind the door. "This handle is jammed." Mike moved towards the door, a newfound spring in his step, and moved aside the heavy table Peter had pulled in front of it. "Weird. It's fine from this side," he harmlessly lied. Captain Hale shrugged. "I'll have to get someone to look at that. Anyway, you two can be on your way. I'll see you tomorrow. We should be back to our real duties, but I can't make any promises." "Sounds good," Mike said, smiling as he set off. Hale silently invited Peter to hang back for a minute. "Does he seem okay?" he whispered. "Mike?" Peter asked. "You mean for tomorrow? He said he only has some bumps and bruises, so he should be okay to work." Hale shrugged. "That's not exactly what I meant, but if you've been speaking to him in here and nothing seemed off, I'll trust your judgment. I just wanted to make sure his mind is in the right place, too. It's a hell of a world we're all trying to get used to." "I think he'll be okay," Peter replied honestly. The bus ride home gave Peter some time to reflect on everything. So much had gone on at work that he'd forgotten about the poor woman and her children from the start of the day, but the memories of her defeated expression came flooding back as he stepped onto the bus. Between that and the chronic effects that Sycamore Systems had clearly had on Mike, he felt more resentful of the new world than ever before. Just as Peter was stepping into his house, a text message popped up in his vision. It was from Mike. "Thanks again, Peter. I mean it. You've saved my life with this. One step at a time, I can get back on track." This brought a much-needed smile to Peter's face. He walked inside with a feeling of warmth that went some way to combating the chilly air of his unheated home. As much as he didn't want to, he was going to have to turn the heating on tonight and worry about the cost tomorrow. Peter's weekly grocery delivery was due in a few hours, so he held off on eating any plain crackers, the only food he had left, to make sure he could fully savor the beans and rice that would soon be his. That basic sustenance meals felt like a treat showed how poorly the system was working for everyday people like Peter. Sycamore's world benefited the few at the top. No one could even try to deny that. But Peter was starting to realize that it was no mere side effect. Instead, it was the whole point of the system's structure. An hour before the delivery slot, a notification popped up in Peter's vision. He expected it to be a reminder, but the reality was a whole lot worse. Overdraft warning. Delivery unavailable. As he read the further information, Peter learned that he had just been hit with an unexpected movement tax bill that meant the cost of his grocery delivery would push him beyond his overdraft limit. And instead of reducing the size of his order, the system had canceled it altogether. The unexpected bill came from a long walk Peter had made to the hospital a few days earlier to visit the only family he had left, an elderly and frail uncle who didn't have long left. Unlike his regular journey to work, which was considered an economically justified journey, Peter had to pay movement tax for his walk. The timing of the debit could hardly have been worse, leaving him with only crackers for dinner. He couldn't even walk to a grocery store, given that the trip would generate more movement tax, unless he purchased something the system considered non-essential and which passed a minimum price over a threshold he couldn't afford. The transaction for his delivery was still showing as pending, which tied up that money and meant even a short walk would take Peter into the no-go zone beyond his overdraft, at which point enforcement action would be taken. Enforcement was the last thing he wanted, since everyone knew what it was a euphemism for. To make things even worse, Peter's negative balance removed his ability to heat his home for the night. The system simply blocked the request, and with all utilities linked to his account, there was no way around it. With several candles burning and a few plain crackers in his belly, Peter Lehman wrapped up in several layers of clothes and surrounded himself in blankets for the night. Despite his good deed in helping Mike, and the warm feeling it had momentarily brought, he was closer to breaking point than ever before. Chapter 3. When Peter awoke at 5 a.m. the next day, the first thing he did was check his balance. He saw that the payment for his canceled grocery order had been fully returned, allowing him to use some of the funds to take the cold sting out of the air with 2 hours of heating. After that, he arranged another grocery order, much smaller thanks to the unexpected movement tax bill, for later that day. Working extra hours, like Mike had been doing, seemed like Peter's only way forward now, to get out of the danger zone at the wrong end of his overdraft allowance. Arriving early for work also seemed like the best course of action, since he could warm up with some free coffee and maybe take advantage of any leftover lunch scraps his colleagues might have. Money problems were so common that there was no longer any shame in asking for small favors. Mike's reluctance to reach out seemed to have been based on the shame he felt for getting himself into trouble by engaging in a vice like gambling. That was a harsh way to view it, Peter felt, given how incessantly the system targeted people's weak spots. With the idea in his mind to arrive at work early, Peter changed his heating schedule from 2 hours to 1. The last thing he wanted to do was waste money letting residual heat fade into an empty house. Hunger rumbled in Peter's stomach as he got dressed for work after a lukewarm shower, which came as soon as he gave up on his restless attempt to sleep for a little while longer. Later, as he headed for the front door, a message popped up in his vision. It warned him that any journey he began before his designated commute time would be subject to the hated movement tax. Peter turned back into the cold-again house and sighed as he collapsed on the couch. This was no life for anyone. Waiting around until the system told you that you could finally travel to work without being taxed for the privilege. He spent the intervening time looking for survey opportunities which could gain him a few account credits in exchange for his time and responses. The payments amounted to a pittance, not even covering the cost of heating his home for the time he spent answering the questions. It was still something, though, and he quickly got into a groove of answering the same kinds of questions for countless brands and services. He didn't know why this was valuable information given how much data the location tracking and visual recordings fed into the system, but he decided to make hay while the sun was shining and spent his entire bus ride completing surveys. He almost missed his stop, and would have if a pop-up didn't suddenly warn him that traveling beyond the stop closest to his designated workplace would, like leaving too early, make the entire journey subject to movement tax. Peter jumped to his feet and pressed the stop button, then stepped off the bus and walked the rest of the way to the station. Even before arriving at work, he had now earned enough to pay for an extra hour of heating, which could definitely come in handy when he got home. Finding ways to stay warm within the parameters of a dystopian system didn't exactly feel like a victory, but Peter would always rather feel warm and bitter than cold and bitter. But within a few seconds of stepping into the fire station, he felt something else. Captain Hale, the only person in sight, was wearing an expression like none Peter had ever seen on him. "What's up? Are they making us do more work on the ad signs today?" Peter asked. Hale gulped. "It's not about that, Peter. It's Mike." Chapter 4. Peter's heart quickened as his mind jumped to the worst-case scenario. He tried to stop himself from getting carried away. No, it just wouldn't make sense. With his biggest problem now addressed thanks to the self-exclusion that Peter's loan enabled, why would Mike still feel suicidal? "His account has been terminated," Hale continued. "As his employer, I just got a call from enforcement to tell me he won't be showing up at work. Apparently, some interest fees took him over his overdraft limit. They've sent him to the local SDU." Peter didn't react. His heart didn't slow. Mike was alive, but that was where the good news ended. An SDU, Secure Dependency Unit, was effectively a poorhouse. Sycamore systems hadn't been in place long enough to know if people typically got out, but the few third-hand stories Peter had heard about SDUs supposedly came from guards who reported conditions as borderline intolerable. It boiled Peter's blood that poor Mike had lost his freedom and his dignity, so much so that the futility of having loaned the younger man so much money didn't even register in his mind. "This is too much," he said, shaking his head in borderline disbelief. "The poor guy is beaten down by ads and responds in the way the system wants him to. Then when they realize he can't pay back the overdraft and interest, they lock him up? I can't take this anymore." "Easy there," Hale said, raising his eyebrows. "Don't talk crazy, Peter." Peter shook his head. "What is it that we're tiptoeing around here? What are we worried about? That we'll end up beside Mike, instead of starving and freezing half to death at home as our reward for being good little consumers who keep our mouths shut? Everyone feels like this. They're just scared to say so. If only someone with a platform would question all of this crap, the dominoes might start to fall." Like Mike's expression the previous day, Hale's was giving a lot away. It didn't take any fancy facial analysis apps to annotate the conflicted feelings etched on his face. He clearly hated Sycamore too, but he couldn't be seen or heard agreeing with any kind of dissent. And with a family at home, he didn't only have himself to worry about. An information screen behind Hale suddenly lit up, accompanied by the familiar tone of an incoming Sicka News special bulletin. Peter knew this would be a universal placement, visible to everyone within a defined geographical area, and automatically pushed onto all designated screens, such as those in workplaces, homes, and malls. It would also be shown on many of the enormous frames Peter and his colleagues had been erecting in recent weeks. In short, it was something the system wanted everyone to see. "We have just received word that Gemma DeMarco, the challenger candidate for next week's mayoral election, has pulled out of the running. DeMarco has been rocked by scandal in recent days and becomes the 5th successive challenger to pull out. Our incumbent city mayor, Blake Britton, is said to be extremely disappointed and is encouraging a new candidate to step forward before tomorrow's live debate here in our Sicka News studio. Any prospective candidate who receives 100 nominations from accredited individuals will be able to stand, and if they achieve sufficient nominations in time, they will also be able to take part in the debate. Otherwise, Mayor Britton will join us for a special sit-down interview. That's all for now. Have a wonderful day and be sure to join us tomorrow evening."
That poor woman, Hale sighed. Britain's team of muckrakers wouldn't stop until they found something. The eyes of the world were on her.
At these words, Peter's eyes lit up.
The eyes of the world, he mused.
"Captain, that's it!" Chapter 5.
"What is what?"
Captain Hale asked.
"Peter, what are you getting at?"
Peter paced the room like an excited child. "Captain, can't you see? I have to stand. I have to challenge Britain and call everything out. Sure, they'll try to destroy me, but what do I have to lose? I'm in the gutter. If there's any chance I can pull them down or shine some light on the crap they're doing to guys like Mike, I have to try." Hale said nothing. "I don't even have to win," Peter went on. "Hell, I know I won't. They're only having the election, and they only scheduled the debate to create an illusion of democracy. We know the votes are digitally counted through their system. We know they could terminate a threatening rival candidate's account at any moment. But just because I can't win the battle tomorrow, that doesn't mean I can't do something that helps us all win the war. Or at the very least, it doesn't mean I can't pierce a hole in their war machine and show everyone that it's not invulnerable. You know how dictatorships end. The slightest crack in the facade shows people the dictator isn't untouchable, and before you know it, they're jumping on the statue's head and waving their flags of freedom." Finally, Hale broke his silence.
"They'll destroy you, Peter. If by some miracle you could get the nominations in time to—"
"Of course I could," Peter interrupted. "We're all accredited. Everyone in the fire service is. I want our roles to go back to real work, not the corporation-benefiting crap we've been doing lately. Everyone agrees. As soon as I announced my candidacy, I'd have my 100 supporters lined up in no time. We had legitimate grievances with Britain's administration long before Sycamore got into bed with the political elites and made things 1,000 times worse, and now I can't stand by for another minute."
"You won't even make it to the debate," Hale sighed. "As soon as you apply and reach the threshold, they'll hit you with everything. You said it yourself. They're in bed with Sycamore. They don't need professional research teams anymore. All of your data is right there for them. All of the data of everyone you know, everyone you've ever known, everyone who has any reason to dislike you. Whatever you're expecting, it'll be 1,000 times worse. DeMarco fought and fought. Now she's pulled out a day before the debate. Doesn't that tell you anything?"
Peter shrugged. "It tells me they were able to get at her, sure. But she has a family. She has a life. She isn't sitting in the gutter with nothing to lose. I don't think there is any real dirt on me for anyone to find, but I don't even care. I told you, I'm not trying to win. I just want to get to that debate and challenge the status quo. That's what it's all about. Sure, they can hear me now. Sure, they'll see me as a threat. I know they'll ridicule me and do live fact checks on everything I say with their biased analysis. But people aren't hearing any public dissent right now. Even if I crash and burn and they make me look like the biggest idiot ever, I might get through to someone."
"That's pretty commendable," Hale admitted. "I don't know what you can say that's really going to shock anyone, though. People know about the ads, the debt, the clampdown on protests, the movement tax. It's all being justified, and some of it has come because of the so-called emergencies they ramped up so people would accept so-called short-term measures. There's nothing you know Sycamore does that everyone else doesn't know. What can you tell the public that's new? What facts? It would just sound like an out-of-touch rant, almost like a old man yells at cloud kind of thing, you know? I just don't see what you can say. A big moment would have to involve you showing something, not telling something. You don't have anything to reveal. There's nothing you can show the world that will make anyone sit up and reevaluate the status quo."
Not for the first time, though. Peter's eyes lit up in sudden realization. Because in that moment, he began to think that there might just be something that would make the world sit up and take notice of Sycamore's massive overreach. And the real trick might be getting them to show it. Chapter 6. Whoa, damn. Are you seeing something weird on that screen? Peter asked, pointing to the now blank screen where the timely Sicca News special bulletin had aired a few minutes earlier. Hale glanced at it and shook his head. Ow! Captain, it's not the screen. There's something wrong with the lights in here. It's causing some kind of interference on my ultra lenses. For the first time in well over a month, Peter then removed his lenses. That's better, he instantly said, breathing a sigh of relief. I can still hear something, though. My eyes aren't hurting anymore, but that could have been bad. I really think you should take yours out for a minute until we figure out where this interference is coming from. Faulty ultra lenses or system interference can cause irreparable vision damage. They told me that on my seating day in the Sicca store. I don't hear anything, Captain Hale replied. Are you sure? Peter asked, raising his eyebrows ever so slightly. Captain, you know I've never had to do anything like this or warned you about a danger. Doesn't that tell you I'm very sure something is wrong, and that you really should remove your lenses for a minute? Belatedly, it clicked in Hale's mind. There was nothing wrong with Peter's vision, and he couldn't hear anything. He was simply creating a plausible reason for taking the very suspicious action of removing his lenses. In this day and age, not wearing ultra lenses was roughly as suspicious as wearing a balaclava would have been in the time before Sycamore. It was a signal to the system and to society in general that an individual did not want their actions to be monitored. Others wearing lenses could still see them and thus would automatically upload footage of their actions to the servers, of course, but the lensless individual's own visual feed would not be available for surveillance or analysis until their lenses were back in place. If it's really that bad, you might be right, Hale said. Thanks, Peter. Peter stayed silent as his captain took the rare step of going blind for a few minutes. The inside of the station's break room didn't look any different to the lensless men now than it had a few minutes ago. The same wouldn't have been true if they had removed their lenses outside, where abundant sprucing up work had been done to make the area look less dilapidated than it really was. In here, no augmented reality decorating had taken place. Peter's living room had some fake wallpaper, on the other hand, which he installed during a free trial period of the app that enabled it. It remained in place even now, with Sycamore letting him keep it to encourage him to utilize the same excellent and utterly convincing technology for a small fee in his other rooms. For Peter, the only telltale sign that he was now blind to Sycamore's augmented reality filter was that Hale's clothing was no longer pristine. It wasn't ragged like Peter's coat, but it certainly wasn't neatly pressed. The first thing Peter did once Hale's lenses were out was to raise a finger to his own lips in a shushing motion. He then pointed to his own ear, wisely remembering that his unremovable in-earphones meant that any snooping Sycamore staff might still hear what he was saying, even if they couldn't see what he was looking at. Hale knew by now that Peter wanted to convey something he didn't want the snoopers to know about, so the shushing came as no surprise. His confused expression, however, suggested very clearly that he didn't know how Peter planned to get his message across without speaking. Peter held up 2 fingers before tapping his wrist and dashing out of the break room. The silent message was easily understood. I'll be back. Give me 2 seconds. Very quickly, Peter returned with the decidedly low-tech medium he had chosen to get his more complex methods across: a ballpoint pen and an old pad of paper from his locker. It's really weird, Peter said out loud. I can still hear the interference. Can you? Stay quiet and see if you can hear it too. He added a wink at the end. Yeah, sure, Hale fumbled. Belatedly, he understood what Peter was doing now as he attempted to justify their silence on top of their blindness, which really would look suspicious if anyone was snooping. They probably wouldn't be right now, Peter figured, but once he applied for his last-minute electoral candidacy, His recent feeds were likely to be the most carefully analyzed in all of the city. Peter then began to write as quickly as he could without losing legibility. They want dirt on me. I can give them fake dirt they shouldn't have. If it's something the public doesn't know Sycamore can access, i.e. something they shouldn't be able to know about me, that fake revelation about me will actually be a real revelation about Sycamore. Any ideas? Hale nodded in approval. It was good. He took the pen. So you're serious about running? He wrote. You would really martyr yourself, with no chance of winning, just to reveal something that opens people's eyes? It was Peter's turn to nod. Commendable, Hale wrote. In that case, I guess we need to ask ourselves, what aren't they supposed to know? Maybe the content of your visual feed from inside your home? They're not supposed to analyze that for advertising use, or really for any use at all. It's supposed to need a police warrant. If you can do something embarrassing or incriminating enough that it makes them show a recording from your visual stream taken inside your house, that would be a huge own goal for them. Peter smiled from ear to ear. Taking the pen back from Hale, he wrote one last message. I'll openly talk about my candidacy to the others, but only about our work-related grievances. No more about the broken system, and nothing about my plan. He underlined the word nothing several times before putting the pen down. The buzzing is stopped, he then said out loud. I think whatever was causing the interference is stopped. I'll put my lenses back into check. Don't put yours back in yet. You weren't seeing the interference anyway, but that doesn't mean it couldn't harm your vision. I'll see if the coast is clear. This was all part of Peter's bid to keep his justification for their lens removal consistent. Yep. My lenses seem fine now, he continued. From now, as Hale began to put his lenses back in, they both knew they had to be more guarded in what they talked about. They had already discussed their dissatisfaction with the system, which didn't feel like the best of ideas, but the specifics of Peter's plan to manipulate Sycamore into exposing its own overreach had at least stayed secret. Fortunately, Hale had ensured this was the case by turning the notepad upside down as soon as Peter had begun putting his own lenses back in. An accidental glance down at the table could have ruined the whole thing and landed them both in hot water if the notebook had stayed in plain sight, so both felt relief that one of them realized it in the nick of time. Peter picked the small notebook up as casually as he could, and without looking directly at it, he placed it in his jacket pocket, deciding to take it home and tear it up or burn it later, perhaps without looking at the pages or perhaps when he could think of some new justification for removing his lenses again. I'll maybe put in a call to environmental health later, just to check on the interference, Captain Hale mused, committed to their story as the highest-risk moments came to a close. And I might put in some calls to get support for my candidacy, Peter replied. Hopefully I don't have to, but I guess first I have to officially apply. We'll see how serious they are about democracy. I guess they've heard me saying the system is broken, but if Britain believes in it, then he should be able to defend it against a nobody like me. Hale hesitated. He didn't know what to say to that, unsure as to exactly which tack Peter was taking. For his part, Peter thought Britain and his corporate backers really did want a debate to take place. Humiliating someone at a podium in front of the world would serve three purposes for the system, he figured. First, on a surface level, it would show that Sycamore and its bought and paid-for candidates were apparently willing to hear dissenting voices. More deeply, though, it would also equate dissent with an individual made to look nonsensical and unreliable, thus undermining the concept. But perhaps most importantly of all, it would serve as a veiled warning. Underneath the veneer of, anyone can run for office would be the subtext, but their character will be summarily executed live on air. Just don't worry about me, Peter went on, saving Hale from his struggle to think of a reply. I'll apply now and be ready to start the day when everyone else gets here. Are we back to real work, or still putting up their stupid screens? We have 3 more screens, Hale sighed. There are increased safety procedures in play today after what happened to Mike, but I couldn't get around the orders. Sorry. Peter shook his head. It's not your fault. It's Britain's. And I'll take it up with him tomorrow. Chapter 7. Even before he headed out with the rest of his crew for another wasted workday erecting advertising signs for Sycamore at Mayor Britton's behest, Peter had not only applied for his candidacy to challenge Britton, but had also received the required 100 nominations. His colleagues were excited that one of their own was going to step forward and challenge the status quo regarding their new working practices, as well as other grievances that they'd wished to air for a long time. Britain seemed to be in with the foundations of the city, as one commentator once put it. When Sycamore's breakthrough technologies were still being dreamed up, he was already ruling the city with an iron grip. Needless to say, that grip had only been strengthened further by the match made in hell between his office in City Hall and Isaiah Amos's at the top of Sycamore's imposing quarter-mile HQ. Many of the firefighters were initially shocked that Peter was putting himself forward, given what they knew always happened to would-be challengers who put their heads above the parapet. Everyone saw what had happened to Gemma DeMarco, and they didn't want the same to happen to Peter. No one tried to talk him out of it, though, because the things he was talking about were quite simply things that had to be said. One even told Peter that he wished he had the nerve to step into the spotlight and challenge Mayor Britton, but that he couldn't take any risks with a young family at home. And that, for Peter, was the real crux of it. Unlike so many others who at least had the love of a close family to get them through the increasingly dispiriting days and nights in Sycamore's corporate dystopia, he had absolutely nothing to lose. On the other hand, he didn't think he had anything to win beyond his pride. That still counted for a lot, but the best tangible outcome he could hope for in the debate was likely a lose-lose situation in which he was punished for embarrassing Sycamore and Mayor Britton in front of the world. But his punishment would only come after Sycamore's embarrassment, he figured. And in that instance, he was prepared to swallow it. As long as he made a difference, it would be worth it. In the meantime, though, Peter's workday seemed to pass more slowly than ever. Countless new precautions were being taken to make sure no more accidents like Mike's occurred, with Peter having told no one that the younger man actually jumped, and with no one else apparently having noticed the subtle clues. Peter received a lot of messages and new friend requests through his forest profile as the day wore on, and word spread across the city's fire stations that he was going to challenge Britain. All of a sudden, however, as his shift neared its end, Peter's vision was all but overwhelmed by an incredible barrage of flashing notifications. "You're officially in!" one of his colleagues yelled in excitement, reading a breaking news story that Peter couldn't yet see thanks to the deluge of messages. As soon as the story went live, complete with a link to his forest profile, first hundreds and then thousands of friend requests came his way. It's working already, Peter smiled to himself. He hadn't even made any public statements yet, much less appeared at a podium beside Mayor Britton, and already he was getting a massive amount of attention. That attention was a means to an end, of course, with Peter never having been one to seek the limelight for his own gain. While Peter navigated his Seed's menu systems for options he had never needed before, like the message notification silencer and the option to automatically accept friend requests, he received a pop-up notification telling him that his outgoing messaging service was currently suspended due to unusual profile activity. Part of him thought that was reasonable enough, since increasing his friend count by a factor of hundreds within a few minutes was about as unusual as profile activity could get. But at the same time, another part of him wondered whether this was the start of Sycamore restricting his ability to communicate with anyone ahead of his big debate the next day. Hale excused Peter to sit inside the fire truck and work through his non-message notifications while the rest of the team wrapped up their final screen-building task of the day. While all begrudged that they had to do the job, none begrudged Peter's break, given what he was willingly getting himself into for their common benefit. Peter found one message that contained instructions for attending the next evening's debate at the Sycamore studio, along with some rules about language and decorum. It was truly surreal. Things like this didn't happen in real democracies, he reflected. Candidates weren't hounded off the ballot paper the day before a debate. In real democracies, opposition parties were never so reluctant to put forward a challenger that only independents like DeMarco and Peter were willing to step into the lion's den. This was all a laughable charade designed to protect the political elite while retaining some semblance of participatory democracy. At best, though, it was a vague pastiche. And that, as much as anything else, was precisely why Peter's plan was so important. When the crew got back to the station and Peter set off for his bus ride home, Hale told him to take the next day off preparing for his debate. The other firefighters gave him a guard of honor, standing on either side of the path to the doorway and applauding as he walked. "Give 'em hell," one called. "You're the best of us, Lehman," another added. He paused and thanked them. Truth be told, he didn't know if he would ever see them again, and he got the feeling they were thinking the same thing. Everyone knew by now what had happened to poor Mike for merely going over his overdraft limit. Having the gall to stand up to people as powerful as Mayor Britton and his corporate backers in a live debate was something else entirely, and no one was foolish enough to think Peter would get off scot-free. No one knew what was coming, least of all Peter himself. But just like all of his colleagues except for Captain Hale, no one at Sycamore had any idea what Peter Lehman had up his sleeve. Chapter 8. When Peter got home, he barely even felt the cold. Such was the level of adrenaline now coursing through his veins, he barely even felt the hunger pangs in his stomach, despite only having had some peanuts from a colleague for lunch. It was a feeling like nothing he'd ever known, a heady mix of excitement and trepidation, but with no modicum of hesitation. Peter wasn't going to second-guess himself, and he also didn't hesitate in getting to work on the plans he'd been mulling over ever since coming up with a general strategy with Captain Hale. Everyone more or less understood that Sycamore monitored consumer searches, messages, movement, and just about everything else for commercial purposes. No system-damaging revelation would come if Mayor Britton threw a gotcha at Peter with any information he was fed, which originated from those sources. But if Peter could provoke Britton's handlers into dropping information they garnered from his visual feed while he was at home, which was officially supposed to be a safe zone from that kind of intrusion at least, that could cause Sycamore some major problems. People would tolerate a lot, but everyone had a breaking point. Peter had found his own earlier that very day, after all, when he heard the news about poor Mike's detention in a secure dependency unit. He wasn't banking on a lot of people taking particular umbrage to potentially being spied on in their own homes, since it was a matter of the degree to which Sycamore had eroded their privacy rights. So much had already been stripped away, piece by piece, that most people were by now numb to the whole consideration, exactly the way Sycamore wanted them to be. But no revolution ever started with a lot of people. If Peter could open the eyes of only a few, a cascading domino effect could quite conceivably kick in. Someone in a position of relative power, perhaps even within the political classes, might be helpfully concerned by what Peter hoped to bring to light. After all, any sane person would realize that whatever surveillance was being conducted on someone deemed a threat to the system could ultimately be used on them if they ever found themselves on the wrong side of the wrong people. With all of this in mind, Peter set about doing several embarrassing and incriminating things, all captured in full HD glory by his always-online ultra lenses. As a firefighter who planned to begin the debate with some opening points about unjustifiable recent changes to his daily job, Peter knew that he had to present himself as a responsible individual. At least, that would have been the case if he was trying to come out of the debate looking good. But when his only goal was to come out of it looking like he had been disconcertingly spied on in his own home, he knew he had to do something too embarrassing for Britton's team to pass up. Like most evenings, Peter began by lighting one of the many candles he typically used to take the chill out of the air in his living room. Unlike any other evening, though, he left its flame deliberately close to the edge of a small muslin curtain. The curtain caught fire, on cue, leading Peter to fake panic as he scrambled around for several seconds before finally dousing it with water from a nearby vase. There was a fire extinguisher much closer to the curtain, but Peter didn't want to look too ready. He was ready, in reality, meaning there had never been any genuine danger from the very localized fire he had started. He could only hope the irony would be too strong for his opponent's team to resist. What with a candidate complaining about his fire-related work duties being reduced by Sycamore's influence, only to look so incompetent and unsafe around fire in his own home. After the curtain incident, and ostensibly to calm his nerves, Peter sat down on his couch with a gift he had been waiting to enjoy for well over a decade. The cigar his late father-in-law had given him on his wedding day. Peter sparked up the cigar and took a few slow puffs before pretending to fall asleep as he held the lit end against his couch. He knew the material wouldn't catch, and it didn't. But when he opened his eyes after a minute or so, he made sure to let his focus linger on the evening's second fire hazard for a few moments before he looked away again and resumed his smoking. Taking no chances with subtlety, Peter left the still-burning cigar resting against his upside-down notebook when he put it down in an ashtray. When his ideas for looking irresponsible had been exhausted, including a few more setups beyond these first three, Peter turned his attention to looking slovenly. He made a deliberate mess of everything he did for the rest of the night, from cooking a basic meal when his rescheduled grocery delivery showed up, to making sure he dropped more ash on the floor than in the trash can when he was finally finished with the large cigar. Stupid maid will get that, he shrugged as he waved his hand at the ash on the floor. Earn her damn money for once. There was no maid in Peter's life, of course, but this line came to him on the fly, and he saw no harm in adding a dash of disrespect to the slovenliness of his ash-spilling scene. Peter placed a ceramic bowl in the trash can on top of the ash for one of his final ideas. Shortly afterwards, he scooped the leftover rice from his pot into the trash, a little wastefulness on top of everything else, only to return with a spoon a little while later and eat some rice from the bowl, in a manner that his viewing angle skewed to make it look like he was eating it directly from the bin. There was no faking the smell of ash, but Peter was quite proud of his videography. Peter ended the night by projecting a movie on the wall of his living room and making extremely chauvinistic comments about almost every actress who appeared. Some of what he'd said and done since coming home took effort to do convincingly, and this was no exception. It didn't take any effort to force himself to try, though, such were the stakes. By the time Peter went to bed, with most of the next day ahead of him as bonus time to do anything else that might strike his mind as a good idea, he felt satisfied by a good night's scheming. In any other circumstances, someone set to go head-to-head with Blake Britton in a live debate would have spent their final night beforehand rehearsing their key points and preparing to rebut Britton's. Needless to say, that wasn't the game Peter was playing. If I can make them believe my lies about Britton, I'll be the most powerful man in the city, Peter mused aloud as he settled in bed, figuring that a few final lines wouldn't hurt. I'll never have to see those idiots at the fire station ever again, either. I'll make the rules, and I'll make all the money I could ever spend. As he closed his eyes, Peter smiled. He hoped the guys wouldn't be too offended if this footage was used as a gotcha. They wouldn't understand why he was calling them idiots, so could quite reasonably hate him for it, but that was a risk he couldn't avoid. For everyone's sake, risks had to be taken. And with no one else stepping forward, Peter Lehman was one step away from the biggest risk of his life. Chapter 9. The biggest day of Peter Lehman's life began like every other one had lately, with the cold air of his bedroom causing his teeth to chatter increasingly violently until he was startled awake. From that moment on, though, the day was like no other. Peter had more new messages than he could read in a week, let alone a day, and the fact that he still couldn't reply to any of them was moot, given that he wouldn't have known where to start even if he could. There was also the point that he really didn't want to talk to anyone until he was at the Sicca News studio, in case he accidentally let anything slip. A dreamless sleep left Peter with no new brainstormed ideas for embarrassing moments, but the fresh light of dawn gave him an idea to vocally regret some of them. "Ah, jeez," he groaned as he stepped into the kitchen and saw his ash-strewn floor. His eyes then turned to the remnants of his burned muslin curtain. This isn't going to look good if they can see it. Peter then spent the next 10 minutes frantically navigating through his seed's menus in a knowingly futile bid to delete footage from his visual stream. He entered search terms making this desire explicit, such as, how to delete embarrassing ultra-lens footage, and can I pay to hide my mistakes? This seemed like the kind of gotcha that Britain's people would use, and Peter thought it would surely be decisively tempting for them to include proof of what those mistakes and pieces of embarrassing footage actually were, as well as his desperation to hide them. Peter's formal invitation to appear on air allowed him to leave home for the Sick and News studio at any time of day to make early use of the dressing rooms or anything else he might need. He imagined this was the general nature of an on-air invitation, rather than anything specific for the day of the debate. Makeup artists were largely a thing of the past in TV studios now that all of the work could be done in real you, and TV personalities could always afford to look their best, and that left Peter knowing he was going to look a very far cry from the kinds of polished anchors and celebrities that the Sick and News audience was used to watching. It also meant there wasn't anything calling Peter to the studio just yet, so he hung around for most of the day. He spent the time watching sports news to make it look like he wasn't taking the upcoming event seriously, while on the inside he was thinking hard about how he could best react to all kinds of eventualities. With 2 hours to go and the studio a short bus ride away, Peter eventually made a move. He got dressed in his smartest clothes and had a hearty lunch before finally setting off. The rain he saw and heard when he opened his front door was decidedly unwelcome, since he had to walk at least as far as the bus stop, even if he wasn't going to walk the whole way to the relatively nearby studio. It would be 20 minutes on foot and around the same via bus, given the likely waiting time, but the rain was strong enough for Peter to opt for the second choice. Sure enough, the bus was late. Very late. At several points, Peter considered walking after all, but just as he was about to resign himself to that fate, a bus finally pulled up. It was full to bursting point, which made for a particularly uncomfortable ride, short or not, given that Peter was now a minor celebrity after being featured on several Sick and News reports throughout the day. I'm not allowed to talk about anything until the debate is over, Peter lied, trying in vain to dodge every question at once. No one seemed hostile or particularly friendly, just interested in seeing someone they recognized from the news. An old man near the back of the bus yelled above the crowd, "You can't beat the system, so why even try?" Peter couldn't think of a suitable answer to that question when it arrived, and was glad when the bus reached his stop moments later. The rain now felt like a welcome respite, and the security around the Sick and News studio building prevented the few pedestrians nearby from getting any closer once Peter crossed the perimeter. Because his account had been authorized for entry to the building at this time, the guards could see a large green checkmark floating in the air above Peter's head. He knew that would be the case, thanks to Sick and News reports he had seen about these kind of advances in security, ironically enough, and it made his walk to the imposing doorway as easy as could be. When he got to those doors, though, Peter felt hesitation for the first time since coming up with his undeniably audacious and quite likely reckless plan. This was the belly of the beast, and he had one final decision to make. Or, more to the point, he had one big decision to make one more time. Fight or flight. Thinking back to the image of poor Mike jumping from the ladder, and the news of his incarceration for the poverty the system had bombarded him into, Peter shook away the doubts. With a sharp exhalation and the hardest gulp of his life, he stepped right in. Chapter 10. Whirlwind didn't cover it. From the moment Peter stepped through the doors, he was whisked from one place to another in a manner that made him certain it was all intended to disorient him. He was fitted with a microphone only for it to then be removed and refitted by someone else. He was asked to submit to not one but 2 drug tests. And after that, he was guided to his podium and told to wait until his debate opponent, Mayor Blake Britton, showed up. Peter noted to his Sick and News handlers that the moderator wasn't here yet either, and that the debate wasn't scheduled to begin for almost an hour. There would be no studio audience even when showtime arrived, but it was very clear that the moment of truth was a long way away. It didn't take a genius to realize that this was all by design. The blazing studio lights made Peter sweat, while all the liquids he'd drunk in order to deliver 2 drug test samples in quick succession were going to make for an uncomfortable time before long. Peter's podium was much higher than Britton's to make him look shorter than he was, hardly an original debating trick, and the overhead lighting was far harsher above him than it would be above Britton. It's all part of the game, Peter mused, trying to stay focused. I know their tricks, but they don't know mine. With 10 minutes to go until the scheduled start time, Peter ignored the instructions of a cameraman and left the studio for a bathroom break. When he returned 2 minutes later, Mayor Britton was standing at his podium and addressing the camera. Well, better late than never, Britton acerbically stated as Peter walked by. Arriving so late is hardly the most respectful way to treat our viewers, but I suppose we all have different standards. Peter bit his tongue. This wasn't the time to engage. The real debate kicks off soon, Britton continued to the camera, seeming more like a moderator than a candidate. First, a word from some of our wonderful sponsors. Britton then dialed down his energy levels when the cameraman gave him the cut signal. It was like watching an actor at work, Peter couldn't help but think. The real moderator arrived soon afterwards and dived into a conversation with Britton that went way beyond cordiality. The man was openly and brazenly coaching Britton with suggestions of how to respond to the questions he would open with, as shameless as he was focused. The studio lights then lowered, with an enormous screen appearing in Peter's eye line behind the moderator. On it, he saw himself. Well, a version of himself. Peter had assumed the tall podium and burning spotlight had been arranged to make him look bad on TV. In reality, these physically manipulative methods were only to throw Peter off his game. He could see now that far more advanced tactics were at play to affect how he appeared to the viewing masses. The changes were so egregious Peter barely recognized himself. His hair was frazzled, and his skin was blotchy, with the powerful features of the beautifying app Real You having been used for the ironic purpose of making him look as haggard and unpresentable as possible. Also on the screen, Peter spotted 2 arrows indicating their relative viewer approval ratings. His was red and point down, naturally, while Britton's was a vibrant, upward-pointing green. He figured that was probably there to distract him too, and was quite likely an entirely made-up number, in any case. The whole election could be rigged, really, and it probably was. Sycamore's system did the counting, after all. But despite that, Britton's backers were leaving nothing to chance and making Peter look terrible, while their candidate struck the pose of a movie star charitably sharing his time and talents with the public. The moderator opened with some introductions, or more accurately, an introduction for Mayor Britton. Peter was left to introduce himself, which he did very humbly, with reference to his role as a firefighter and lifelong local of the city. As Peter spoke, the arrow signaling his approval rating pulsed and grew in size, turning an even darker red. If this reflected any real viewer input, he figured his voice was probably being manipulated in a negative way just like his appearance was. Aside from all of the shenanigans, though, the debate actually began more positively than Peter could have imagined. Positively may have seemed like a misnomer for anyone who didn't know his true goal, but the moderator's loaded opening question about Peter's fitness to responsibly protect public safety in his role as a firefighter seemed like it was coming from a very specific angle. I'm extremely responsible when it comes to fire safety, Peter said, fighting a shaky voice that sounded weak even before any Sycamore magic degraded it further. He coughed to clear his throat. As a firefighter, that's a 24-hour focus. A huge message appeared on the screen behind the moderator, signaling what the viewers at home would see. Fact check. Peter Lehman experienced a domestic fire event last night. Before he had even gotten to explaining the motive for his candidacy with any discussion of employment grievances or anything else, Peter felt an unexpected early surge of comfort. It was working. He suppressed a smile and tried to look shocked. I wouldn't call it a fire, he said. I was enjoying a cigar to relax after a long day at work and before this debate, as anyone could understand, and a spark of ash touched the couch, that was all. The moderator turned around to face the screen, which then morphed into a replay of the previous night's curtain fire incident filmed from Peter's point of view via his ultra lenses. It was too good to be true. "That's not what it looks like," Peter said. He knew that in going for a gotcha, the moderator and his allies had just fallen into Peter's trap at the first opportunity. "And I put it out right away. Like I said, I spent the night getting ready for today." It wasn't yet the right time to point out that this kind of footage, shot in the privacy of his own home, was only supposed to be accessible to law enforcement officers with a warrant if a serious crime was being investigated. The ancient wisdom came to mind. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. Another thought in Peter's mind was that a domestic fire might actually count as some kind of emergency, automatically triggering content to be flagged by human overseers in case a citizen needed assistance. As soon as he considered this, Peter knew it was too early to call anyone out. If he went too soon, he would blow his only chance of opening some people's eyes to the dystopian world their society was lurching deeper into by the day. "I spent the night working to assist my constituents in every way I could," Britton retorted. "It must be nice to sit around smoking cigars while others are doing all they can to make ends meet in these tough economic times." Peter took a deep breath. It was go time. Not time to call them out, quite yet, but time to draw them out into making the decisive mistake he was counting on. "Times are tough because of the policies and sycamore features you and your friends are forcing upon us," Peter countered. "Don't act like this economic situation is some random event you're trying to fix. You're causing it. Meanwhile, firefighters and teachers and hard-working cleaners are working themselves into the ground just to stay afloat." The trap was laid. A grin crossed the moderator's face. "Hard-working cleaners, you say?" he began. "Well, Mr. Lehman, your attitude in public seems very different to the way you talk about people when they're not listening." Like clockwork, footage aired of Peter dropping ash on the floor and commenting that his, quote, stupid maid would take care of it and, quote, earn her damn money for once. Far more so than the first time, Peter now really had to fight to contain his own smile. The plan had worked. "I didn't know anyone would hear any of that," he said, forcing a gulp in a bid to look like he'd been caught red-handed. On the inside, his mental gears were whirring with delight. Seconds later, footage of Peter appearing to eat rice directly from his trash can filled the screen, leading Mayor Britton to shake his head in disgust and comment that this embarrassment had gone on long enough. In a well-rehearsed moment, the moderator said he was almost finished, then aired quick-cut footage of Peter disparagingly commenting on the actresses in the TV show he had watched, followed by his late-night musings about his idiot colleagues in the fire station. "I think Mayor Britton is correct," the man said. "This has gone on long enough. Mr. Lehman, you are clearly not fit to stand for office. How can you even begin to explain all of this?" Peter took several seconds to think of the best way to word his response. It all came down to this, his one big swing, and the pressure of the moment was sufficient to ensure that he didn't have to pretend to be thinking hard. "Well, I think I'd explain it by saying Sycamore has been illegally passing on private footage from my visual feed, shot inside my own home where privacy is supposed to be guaranteed unless a law enforcement warrant is in place. Now, since I haven't committed any crimes, I think you two are the people who have some explaining to do. Why are you spying on civilians in their own homes for corporate and political gain? That isn't what we signed up for." Britton and the moderator exchanged an extremely tense glance for several seconds. It was broken only by a sudden change in the studio's lighting as the huge screen faded to black. The door to Peter's left then burst open, with 3 uniformed guards storming in like a serial killer was on the loose. Britton looked at Peter and shook his head. "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes." Barely 5 seconds later, a rough tackle from the charging guard sent Peter crashing to the floor. Chapter 11. Peter's ribs ached. His head ached. His everything ached. The guards were rough with their tackle and no gentler with their handcuffing. When they pulled Peter upright, they were just as rough with their dragging. But as uncomfortable as all of that was, it mattered less to Peter than the feeling in his heart and soul. It was a feeling of pride for taking a stand against a system he could no longer stomach, despite the personal costs. And as the guards led Peter out of the room, pride for having tried turned into an even better feeling. Joy for having won. Peter's threshold for feeling victorious didn't involve an impossible outcome like seeing the system collapse overnight, because that remained a long way away. Before leaving his house for the debate, he decided that reaching people with this truth and receiving confirmation that some of them didn't like it would be enough for him to feel like it had all been worthwhile. Both confirmations came at once when Peter's vision was overwhelmed by notification that his account name was being mentioned and tagged in public discussions on Sycamore's Forest app. Though his hands were cuffed, he remained able to touch his left palm with his right fingers, enabling him to gesture and read some of the messages. "Damn, that messy-looking dude just blew this whole thing up," the first said. "They're spying on us even at home? Not cool," another noted. The last he saw was short and simple. "Whoa, who could have guessed that Peter Lehman guy was the hero we needed?" By the time Peter was bundled into a car outside, all of his notifications were gone. A striking "account terminated" message appeared in the center of his vision, making it hard to see anything else. The past tense note of the last message he saw, stating Peter was the hero the city needed, seemed only too appropriate now. But Peter hadn't stepped forward under any illusions that he could walk away when his job was done. What counted was that the job was done, more smoothly than he could have hoped, even if the aftermath was rougher and more painful than he would have liked. Peter didn't care to be a hero or even remembered as a martyr. All he cared about was being seen and heard, to open people's eyes to the dystopian world Sycamore was building around them. There was a long way to go, and Peter knew Britton and the moderator would probably already be back on air by now, giving carefully worded explanations about the footage that had incriminated Sycamore more than it had incriminated Peter. But despite that, he knew that the genie was out of the bottle. No one would be taken to the streets quite yet, but Peter had just pierced the first hole in a facade of fascistic corporate control that previously seemed impenetrable. Whether he would be taken to a secure dependency unit like poor Mike, whose treatment had prompted him into this desperate action, or whether he would face a fate even worse, Peter regretted nothing. He would rather die free than live under a corporate boot, especially when the revelations that brought about his own end could also bring about the beginning of Sycamore's. This was bigger than him, just like it was bigger than any of the other individuals who had witnessed his cunningly crafted exposé. But together, the citizenry could be strong enough to stand up to the system. And now that Peter Lehman had so bravely played his part, it was over to them. Thank you for listening to Sycamore, System Breaker. Written by Craig A. Falconer. Narrated by Stephen Barnett. Text and production copyright 2023 by Craig Falconer.